Hello, everybody. It's Uncle John from Your Story Hour, and we're back for another chapter from Too Much Salt and Pepper by Sam Campbell. We're ready for chapter 3, and it's entitled Such Language. Each day was bulging with events and adventures so that the mysterious letter was half forgotten. Interest in the matter was suddenly revived, however, when Jenny snatched from one morning's mail an envelope bringing a reply to what she had written. Again, she wrote and mailed a letter, of which I was refused the slightest information. In helplessness, I left the matter to developments. A survey of the trees of the island made me somewhat uncomfortably conscious of the nibblings and gnawings of our porky friends and what they had done during the winter. They had bitten their autographs into almost everything that could be reached. Numerous trees had been scarred: balsams, birches, cedars, white and red pines, cherries, maples, oaks. There seemed to be none immune. Most of the trees were not seriously injured. Many had been bitten slightly at one small spot, as if the porcupines were only tasting them. However, one red pine that stood beside our little back porch had been completely peeled of bark from top to bottom. It was a lusty young pine, some 40 feet high, and we disliked losing it. We told the porkies so. In fact, we gave them a mighty severe reprimand, to which they listened with interest, and then decided that we were playing with them and started a lively romp. But we knew well that if we were not prepared to stand such losses, we had no right to have porcupines for pets. Their friendship must be rated as worth this cost, or not accepted at all. After all, no matter how friendly they might be with us, they were still porcupines and must live as porkies. Bark is their principal winter food. When snows are deep and travel difficult, a porcupine will select a tree to his particular liking, climb it, and live there perhaps for several weeks. During this time, he will scale the bark from the tree, eating much of it. Of course, the tree cannot live after that. Our fine red pine was gone. But Salt and Pepper had behaved simply as porcupines. It was nothing to them that the tree was one of our favorites. They were born to an infinite forest, and all trees were created for their use, as near as they could tell. Furthermore, in nature's overall plan, porcupines benefit the woods by their gnawing. They thin out timber stands so that there will be fewer trees, perhaps, but far better ones. Before we criticize them too harshly, let us remind ourselves that the grandest forests in the world have reached their perfection while porcupines lived within them, and men did not. Gradually, Salt and Pepper were weaned away from their gnawing at the door and the floor joist. When they found that we were not going away again, and they were not so anxious to be with us every moment. Besides, they need not spend all their time and energy in chewing tasteless old boards. They had found a new diversion. Screen doors had been hung, and screens placed on the windows. The doors especially made a wonderful scratching, and this different kind of sound got them very quick results. As the nights grew warmer and the windows were left open, they formed another habit which ultimately caused us considerable embarrassment with our neighbors. In the evening, especially when Jenny and I would be talking or reading aloud, they would climb into a tree just outside our window and enter into the conversation in a most disconcerting way. Right in the midst of our words, they would break in with their little honk, 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 and continue it so insistently that sometimes we had to give up. One night, Jenny was reading from Emerson's essay, Self-Reliance. She had reached those very wise words where this great man tells us something we should all know. There is a time in every man's education when he arrives at the conviction that envy is ignorance and imitation is suicide. Honk, 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 honk. This sound came from a tree outside the window. Jenny added power to her tones, determined that she would not be interrupted. That we must accept himself. That he must accept himself for better or for worse as his portion, and though honk, 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 and though the wide universe is full of good, no kernel of nourishing corn can come to him except through his toil. Honk, 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 honk. Jenny drew a deep breath and stubbornly continued, except through his toil bestowed upon that plot of ground which is given to him to till none but he, honk, 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 none but he can know what that is that he can do, honk, honk, nor does he, honk, 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 nor does he know until he has tried. During the last words, Jenny's voice had increased until she was fairly shouting. Honk, 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 came the rising cries from outside the window. Salt and pepper, such manners! Jenny started a reprimand that was never finished. The porcupines, hearing words addressed to them, turned loose an avalanche of honks that monopolized the occasion. More and more we were seeing the great difference in the two porcupines. Salt, although the male, was the more affectionate of the two, wanting always to be with us. He liked to be cuddled. When we would take him in our arms and, regardless of sharp quills, squeeze him to us, he would relax, let out a sigh of contentment, and remain perfectly still as long as we held him. One night, Jenny took him in her arms and, swinging him back and forth as one would a baby, sang a little lullaby. That was just grand for Salt. Back he came the next night, at about the same time, for an encore. Jenny obliged him. After that, every evening expecting this bit of mothering. He would refuse food or any other kind of attention until Jenny put him through his lullaby. Pepper, the female, leaned more toward the wilderness. She sought the tops of tall trees, explored the mystery of brush and logs. Salt would leave whatever he was doing, even his sleeping, which was his principal occupation, to pester us and play with us. Not so with Pepper. We were a mere incident in her life and not the sole object of her affection. She would come to us, behaving at such times somewhat as Salt did, but always with much more reserve. Frequently we found her in trees at the far points of the island, and by her manner she showed us clearly that she would rather not be disturbed. Sometimes she would be in the shallow waters at the shoreline, looking in the direction of the great forest on the mainland, silently listening and seemingly yearning for the adventures she might find there. But Salt was much more contented with his island and with us. It was he who was watching for the door to open so that he could pounce upon us. It was he who would chew on our window sill in the middle of the night and call to us whenever he heard us. Yes, and many times when he didn't. During these days, we were learning more of the language of the porcupines. He has a surprising variety of tones, calls, expressions, each with a specific meaning. One still night, we heard a startling scream coming from a stand of pine trees on the mainland. We could not identify it. The quality of the voice suggested a porcupine, but neither Jenny or I had ever heard one make a noise like that before. It seemed to be a distress cry, not unlike the shriek of an excited monkey. Several times the cry was repeated. So certain did I feel that some creature was in serious agony that I went forth in my canoe to investigate. When I landed on the far shore, the cry ceased for a time. Then suddenly it issued forth from a tree almost directly over my head. With my flashlight, I searched through the foliage. The startling cry was given once more, and there in the crotch of a tree I discovered an enormous old porcupine, perfectly relaxed and certainly the picture of comfort. His eyes were closed, and he seemed to be asleep. As I watched him, he gave the maudlin cry again. He did not even lift his head or open his eyes. Perhaps he was undergoing a porcupine nightmare. Maybe he dreamed he was a wildcat, and if so, he was doing a right good job at impersonating one. I wanted to make sure that he was all right, so I tossed sticks up into the foliage near him. He stirred himself, got to his feet, looked down at me resentfully, and then with fine agility climbed higher to another crotch, where he settled in comfortably. Clearly, there was nothing at all wrong with him. As I went back to my canoe, he gave that weird cry again. I do not know its meaning. Maybe it is the most far-reaching call for a mate. Maybe it is simply the animal's effort to express himself. Perhaps it is a challenge to his enemies. Whatever the purpose of it, it is one of the most moving calls I have known in the forest, even challenging the fearful shriek of the lynx for wild fury. We have never heard Salt or Pepper give this cry. However, there was something of it in Salt's voice whenever Pepper had wandered away from him. At such times his calls had a touch of loneliness in them. His voice would begin high, descending the scale in little staccato grunts, the quality of which could arise only from a lonely heart. We knew well their little play talk that went on as they scuffled with each other. It was a mumbling, grumbling series of sounds that were playfully resentful. We knew the cross tone that seemed to say, "Let me alone and get away from here." This one uttered by the first one, but who tired of playing and wanted to quit. We knew their hunger call, which told us to bring them some bread, some cookies, or some peanuts. We knew and loved their soft notes of contentment, their highest expression of happiness uttered when they were given liberty to chew our hair and bite the backs of our heads, and we knew well the little grunts of happiness that were uttered when anything pleased them. Through knowing the meaning of their calls, we could understand something of what went on in their minds. One day we had enticed Pepper into a sunny spot to take pictures of her. The sun was hot that spring day, and if there is one thing a porcupine likes less than all others, it is hot sun. We lured Pepper into desired poses by offering bites of tasty food and by petting and playing with her. But all the time she was blinking discontentedly and becoming very tired of the sun. Of a sudden, she became animated with decision. She faced about, pointing toward a shed underneath which the ground would be cool and where the sun could not shine. Then she gave a series of those little happiness grunts. Unquestionably, she had thought of this place where she could be more comfortable. It takes a lot to make a porcupine run, but she ran that day straight to that shed and far back underneath it. We could not coax her out for the rest of the day. Know what this little talk means, we were able to interpret another adventure one of those first evenings home. Hoping always for our many forest friends to come to us, we had been placing a pan of food out near our island cabin every night. In the previous season, creatures from the mainland had been regular customers at this outdoor cafeteria. One of our favorite sights was to see a circle of raccoons about the pan with Salt and Pepper trying hard to edge their way in and get some food that they wouldn't have eaten at all if they had not believed others would wanted it. We had just retired that night when we heard Salt and Pepper scuffling, giving their competitive little calls as they tried to bite and push each other around. Suddenly, this call ceased, and we heard the little happy grunt. Something had happened to please them greatly. The change in their mood was so sudden it puzzled us. We arose and tiptoed to the window, all the while hearing their happy call. There we saw what had so delighted them. The raccoons had returned, probably for the first time since the previous autumn. Salt and Pepper had remembered their friends and obviously were glad to see them. The raccoons, too, were giving a dainty trill, which is their manner of expressing pleasure. It was plain that these creatures had formed a happy acquaintance and possibly a real friendship. But in truth, we human beings know only enough about the language of animals to understand that there is much more to learn. We know the purring of a cat means contentment, and we know how the same creature cries when in distress. We understand some of the expressions of dogs, their little barks of happiness when things are right, their whines and howls of discontent when things are not so good. A hunter knows well the baying of his hound when the creature is following a trail, and he understands the short, sharp barks when the dog has treed his game. A farmer knows the meaning of the mooing of his cow and the whinny of his horse. A woodsman hears the howling of a wolf, the bark of a fox, and can be fairly sure what these creatures are saying. Yet, at best, we are only catching a word here and a word there from a vast animal language. There are things we can observe, but cannot explain. We do not understand how creatures communicate complete ideas. We cannot explain how a doe instructs her fawn in absolute silence. We do not know what call assembles conventions of animals, rabbits, squirrels, birds, and sometimes leads them to great migrations. On occasion, when we see flocks of wild geese flying as do our planes in V-shaped battle formation, we hear their calls, their commands. But what has brought them together? By what method have they chosen their leader? How all know what they are doing? This is beyond our knowledge. And by what method do the birds pass around the world that our feeding station has been opened for business? And by what method do the birds pass around our feeding station has been opened for business? The first day food is put out, perhaps 3 or 4 drop in, but within a week there will be scores of them. Some way the news has been spread around, and there is that remarkable observation about ants. When one of them, having discovered a huge bit of food too large for him to lift, returns to his colony and gets help, what does he do to present the problem to his fellows? How does he say the equivalent of, "Come on, Jim, Jack, Hortense, and Percival, I need your help"? Yet, in some manner, he does it. For a right number of helpers will follow him to the burden and bring it in. Yes, there is much more going on in this world of nature than most people suppose. We have caught a few audible words of a vast and universal language. There is no such thing as a dumb animal, unless it may be that we are pretty dumb when we call them that. And that's the end of Chapter 3. Tune in tomorrow, and Aunt Nikki will bring you Chapter 4 from Too Much Salt and Pepper by Sam Campbell. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.